thrilled. Oh, welcome everyone to this Carnegie Endowment Summer Reads Chat. We're really thrilled to have Megan Kate Nelson with us today. Aside from one of her most esteemed virtues, which is being a fellow Coloradan, Megan is also a Pulitzer Prize finalist for The Three-Cornered War, which came out in 2020. And this year, proving that she's also prolific, she released another book called Saving Yellowstone. Megan is a historian who has written about American history, and Saving Yellowstone attracted me because it's a story about the political and social currents around preservation. And at Carnegie, we're starting to do more work in thinking about the politics, both domestic and internationally, around climate and ecological survival of our planet. And it occurred to me that it would be interesting to kind of try to mine the history of the 19th century to see what lessons might have been learned in earlier contests over preservation. That was the original interest in it. And then what I found as I read the book was this really rollicking tale, which is beautifully told, that centers around three characters, and that tells the story of the creation of the United States' first national park. Megan, thank you for being here with us today. And because some of our listeners, some of our audience may not have had the chance to read the book yet, which is wonderful, and I commend it to you. I wondered if you would just tell us about how you struck upon this topic, because like so many great topics of historical works, it's a kind of, it's not an obvious one, and yet when you dig into it, it has so many themes that are still resonant today. And so I wonder if you could just give folks an overview of how you arrived at this.
Sure, of course. And thank you so much for having me here, Dan. This is great. I already know I'm going to love this conversation. So I usually find my book topic as I'm finishing my previous book. Sometimes a little late in the game, which can worry my agent sometimes that I don't have something, a big rolling list of topics. But in the Three-Cornered War, I was writing the story of John Clark, who was the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. And so I started researching surveys and the history of surveying in America, because surveys are federal projects and they're really interesting. They're funded by Congress. Usually, they're sent out early in the 19th century, usually under the leadership of military officials. And during this kind of mid-century period, they really gain ground and they start defining, especially the West, for America. They start sending back sketches and maps and really detailed surveys of what kind of natural resources lay between the Pacific and the Mississippi River. And so I became interested in that in general, and then ran across Hayden's survey. And this was back in about 2018. And I realized that we were coming up on the 150th anniversary of both Hayden's survey and the passage of the Yellowstone Act, which the survey directly led to. And so, for historians, anniversaries, and I think for a lot of people, these are moments where we mark a moment and we think about, why were these events and why were these places important in the past? And then are they still important in the same ways today? A little bit of what you were referencing before about, do these concerns still exist? Do we still have the same sort of feeling toward Yellowstone now that we did, 150 years ago? And so that was a primary impetus. And then when I started looking into it, I realized, so many great books have been written about Yellowstone and about Hayden and the other two major players in the book, Jay Cook and Sitting Bull, but no one had really considered them together in one book, and no one had considered them in the context of Reconstruction, because this is all happening in 1871 and 72, a really pivotal time in American history and in the history of Reconstruction. And, usually we think about Reconstruction as only happening in the South. And so I was really interested to see what would happen if we looked at Reconstruction from Yellowstone, and then looked at Yellowstone kind of in that fuller context of Reconstruction, and what could we learn that would be new.
Great. I agree. That's part of what makes it a really fascinating story. And I want to come to the kind of two-faced view of the imposition of federal power that comes through in the story that you tell. One of the things that was striking to me, though, you mentioned even before you get to the preservation, is the congressional funding of what was scientific and broader research. And as you said, I mean, the funding for the expedition, it was, I think, an unprecedented amount of money, $40,000 for the expedition in the summer of 1871. And this was at a time when the federal government was actually cash strapped, was actually investing a great amount of money in rebuilding the South, rebuilding damage in the North as well. And I wonder what you think captured the spirit. What was behind that that willingness to spend on exploring in a time of rebuilding?
Right. I think this is a great question. And it is one of the questions that was driving me in the project too. Like, why would the 41st Congress give him what the equivalent today is almost $1 million? So why would they give him that kind of money in this moment of economic chaos? And I think part of the answer to that question has to do with Reconstruction. I mean, this period, 1871, still only really 6 years out of a really disastrous and destructive Civil War. And many Americans were really looking for something to believe in, some sort of project, right, that would make them feel better about America. And would give them a sense that America was unique and exceptional. Because they had just been through this very traumatic experience, and I think they wanted to believe in something. And Congress had always funded surveys, partly for scientific reasons, and then partly, mostly, really for developmental reasons. They wanted to know how they could develop the lands, particularly in the West. Could they be ranched? Could they be mined? What actually was out there? And in 1870, Yellowstone was one of the few unmapped places left in North America. And so I think there was a cultural reason for going. There was also maybe an economic reason for going. There was okay, well, if we invest this money now, we'll send these surveyors out. They can give us this information. Maybe, who knows what Yellowstone holds? No one really knew. There were all kinds of rumors. So maybe there's a huge gold mine under Yellowstone. Maybe that'll work. There was a great sense of discovery and a need to kind of know what was out there, which was, I think, very appealing to Republican politicians at this moment.
One of the things the book kind of brings forward is this intersection between nature, discovery or exploration, and private property, and the connections between the three. And I think there's an interesting story to be told in the 19th century context. It's also an interesting story in that at that time it felt like it was all benefit. I mean, it was laying claim. Part of it was laying claim. And part of the challenge we have now is assigning responsibility. And I wonder whether you saw any foreshadowing of the current challenges that we face around preservation in the more euphoric laying claim era.
Oh, absolutely. And this was one of the big surprises. Not a lot of historians talk about the actual nuts and bolts, the nitty gritty of how the Yellowstone Act was passed and what the debates were. And if you go into the congressional record, it's all there like that. And there were disagreements, and some interesting arguments came up. A senator from California during the Senate debate kind of asked, well, if Yellowstone's geothermal fields are so kind of useless, right? This was one of the major arguments, that wilderness is useless. Therefore, or this place can't be used in any other way. So we're going to preserve it. If it's so useless and no one's going to use it in that way, then why do we have to preserve it? Why do we have to pass special legislation? So it was a kind of like laissez-faire argument, a proto laissez-faire sort of, just let Yellowstone be. No one's going to mess with it. Why would they mess with it if nothing can be done with it? So that was one argument where I thought, oh, we see shades of that today too, right? But then the two major arguments in the House debate and partly in the Senate as well, one had to do with federal power. Was the Yellowstone Act, which purported, they were proposing to take, more than 1 million acres of land, and they were going to take it from Wyoming, Montana, a tiny part of Montana and Idaho, and give it to the Department of the Interior to manage. And this was unprecedented. The Yosemite Act in 1864 had taken up those lands but given them to the state of California to manage, right? So this was a different kind of proposal. And so there were even some moderate Republicans in this period who were very uncomfortable with what this meant in terms of federal power and a kind of federal overreach, that the federal government could just take this land from already established territories and give it to the federal government, take it out of production, because that was the explicit goal of the Yellowstone Act, was to take it out of production and just leave it for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, and for science. And so that was one, and that is still with us today, right? I mean, this informs all of our major debates about public lands, the extent of federal power, the extent of state power. Does that supersede private property? Because that is the other big argument about the Yellowstone Act in this period. Is it, they were arguing about whether it was right to take any lands away from possible development, because the kind of perceived right that white Americans felt they had across the nation to be able to purchase lands or just take them by squatters' rights or preemption and develop them was a fundamental core notion of manifest destiny, of the American dream. And it was, especially in the West, a deeply held right. And I think we see that, today constantly. And the right of individuals not only to purchase land, but then also for businesses, to corporations to buy and develop land. So I was most struck in my research about how resonant those arguments still are today. I mean, these are the major things that we argue about when we talk about the future of public lands, and in all of their forms, whether they're national parks or historic sites, national monuments, all of those iterations, we're still arguing about those major kind of perceived rights and also legal rights of ownership and use.
I want to just, as a side note, encourage anybody in our audience who'd like to ask Megan a question to please go ahead and put your question in on YouTube. You should be able to ask it, and we'll be able to turn to that in the second half of this conversation. And so please do submit your questions. I want to pick up another unique aspect of the book as I thought about, what would distinguish this book, likely distinguish this book from a book that was written maybe even only 10 years ago or 20 years ago, also by a white American historian. And that is the way in which you weave the story of Indigenous people through this history. And obviously, not only through the perspective of Sitting Bull, who plays a pivotal role, and there are echoes there in terms of thinking about the resistance to the building of a railroad, which you can say more about, and the resistance to, say, the building of a pipeline in the 21st century. But I wonder how you approached, how you thought about trying. It's obviously purposeful, but how you thought about integrating a part of American history that has too often been not fully told, and certainly not fully integrated with other parts of our national story.
Right, definitely. I mean, and especially with the history of conservation. I mean, I think it's an inescapable fact and sort of a dark history of conservation that it is based in native land dispossession. I mean, all of these parks, all of the lands designated and taken out of private ownership were Indigenous homelands, and Indigenous peoples across the country had been stewards of the land for thousands of years. And it's really in this period that the U.S. campaign to kind of remove and contain and surveil Native peoples on reservations. I mean, these campaigns really start to intensify during the 1860s and the 1870s. And so that is part of the context. And Sitting Bull comes into this story. He's a Hunkpapa Lakota chief who really kind of bursts onto the scene in this period because he is very steadfast in his resistance to any white encroachments on his homelands, which Lakota homelands were huge in this period. They extended from the Missouri River to the Yellowstone Basin. And white settlers had been trying to cross it since the gold strikes in Montana in 1863. And the Lakota peoples had always resisted those efforts and any efforts to settle in their homelands. And when Jay Cook sent his surveyors out, who were protected by U.S. Army cavalry units, to survey a potential railroad route for the Northern Pacific that would go directly through Lakota lands and then go north of Yellowstone, which is why, Jay Cook becomes involved in this and involved in Hayden's survey because of his interest in bringing people to Yellowstone on that railroad. Sitting Bull consistently over the course of 3 years pushes those surveyors out of his territory and goes to see federal Indian agents who are stationed at forts along the Missouri and says, we can have peace if you want, but you're going to have to keep the Northern Pacific off our lands. And that story, what I realized as I was researching is that these pivotal years when Sitting Bull kind of starts to articulate this particular kind of resistance and begins to bring a group of like-minded Native people kind of into his orbit, Cheyenne and Arapaho people, also Crazy Horse of the Ogallala Lakota, that he kind of emerges here and begins to shape a response to U.S. Military power and also settler colonialism that leads directly to the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Greasy Grass. And that was very interesting to me because I think usually we think of Sitting Bull only in the context of that battle with Custer, right? But it has its origins before this, and it has its origins in Sitting Bull's defense of his homeland, which was kind of bisected by the Yellowstone Valley. The Yellowstone River was an extraordinarily important water source for the Lakota people. And yes, I was writing this, sort of in the wake of the Standing Rock protests, and really seeing that resistance as a through line, that Native people were there in this moment and resisting, and they are still there, right? And still resisting. So there is a theme in the book of Native persistence and survival, even though there was, this period was a moment, I think a watershed moment for Lakota peoples and other indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, and also for U.S. Indian policy. So it was a time of great change, but also one of indigenous persistence. So I felt really strongly that I wanted to integrate that story into the story of the exploration and preservation of Yellowstone, because it is part of that larger picture, and of the West and how the federal government is trying to bring the West into the United States at this particular moment in time.
One of the things that struck me about I agree very much with the kind of this being the prequel to this. If people know about Sitting Bull, the story they know comes later in some sense, and this is really a prequel to leading up to that. And one of the things that struck me was just how important the political diplomacy was that he engaged in for many years. This was not, we get told a story that is focused on the more bellicose chapters, and really this was a statesman who was trying to figure out a way through a really thorny set of political issues. One of the special things I think about the book, like any good history, it surfaces characters who probably aren't well known to most Americans. One of whom is Colonel Parker, and I wonder if you could just share with the audience kind of the backstory of that particular character, because I think it would be interesting for a lot of people to know, as we have our first Native Secretary of the Interior now today in 2022, that there was a precedent of sorts.
Yes. Ely Parker had been friends with Ulysses S. Grant in Illinois. They had gotten to know each other. And I argue in the book, because I really think this was true, Ely Parker was Grant's superior in every way, right? He was much more well-educated. He was really talented. He was a bit of a polymath. And Grant really admired him, and they became friends. And Grant wanted him to come with him to fight in the war. But the US Congress wouldn't let him because Native people were not considered citizens at that moment in time. And so, but Grant pulled some strings and got him on his staff. And Ely Parker was present at Appomattox during the Lee surrender. And there is a very famous but apocryphal story about how Ely Parker had beautiful penmanship, and he was writing out the terms of surrender. And Lee purportedly kind of stopped and and was really surprised to see him there because Ely Parker is Seneca. And, you know, just sort of was like, oh, I'm, surprised to see you here. And Ely Parker was supposed to have said, well, we are all Americans. And this is a story that's been widely repeated. It actually did not happen. And Ely Parker said later that it did not happen. But what it did is that experience that he had with Grant in the war really led Grant to bring Parker in as his Commissioner of Indian Affairs during his first presidential term. And so this was the highest post that any Indigenous person had ever held in the government. And he was a really interesting appointment. This is Grant sort of had two very interesting appointments. One was Ely Parker, the other was Amos Ackerman as his Attorney General. And the interesting thing that Parker did is sort of push Grant toward what could have been a very progressive Indian policy for the time. And even kind of now, Ely Parker had this interesting idea. He was an assimilationist. He did believe that Native people were going to have to surrender, move to reservations, and become, quote unquote, civilized in order to join America fully as citizens. But his idea was to gather all of the indigenous peoples in the West into one or two territories, and that they would have actual status as territories and then would apply to become states, so that indigenous peoples would have consistent and long-term representation in Congress. Which, I mean, you think about that idea now, it seems like such a revelation. Like, yes, of course they should have done that. And Grant started to argue for it, but Congress was not behind it. Republicans were not behind it. And, they wanted to shore up their political power. So any territories that they brought into the Union they had to be sure they were going to be Republican leaning. And ultimately, Parker kind of made a singular mistake during his tenure, and Congress really attacked him, and he resigned in July of 1871. So, and once he did that, once he kind of left Grant's kind of group of advisors, Grant really never embraced any kind of interesting or creative Indian policy from there on out. He kind of regressed to his military background and began to support accelerated campaigns against indigenous peoples in the West and other areas of the nation as well.
You mentioned Ackerman as one of the other interesting appointments of Grant's, and that allows a kind of a pivot toward one of the things that I enjoyed about the book was this kind of push and pull of the focus of the federal government between Reconstruction era, the Reconstruction era South and the exploration of the West, both in terms of resources and in terms of military power and overstretch, because the army was needed in both places. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, I mean, on the one hand, you saw the exercise of federal power, and you can tell the story of Ackerman because it's fascinating, especially given that he was a Southerner. The exercise of federal power for what we would probably recognize as mostly good aims in Reconstruction South, in the Reconstruction South, and then at the same time, pushing back or protecting these survey teams for the railroad, et cetera, in the West, and confronting indigenous people there.
Yeah, this was a tension that really interested me, and I think this is the benefit of situating Yellowstone in its historical context, is that we do see that larger picture. We see, okay, this is the same Grant administration and the same Congress launching, well, actually voting then on the Yellowstone Act and passing it, and sending investigative groups down to South Carolina and North Carolina, other parts of the Deep South, to really find out what was happening in the post-war period to Black Southerners who are attempting to exercise their 14th and 15th Amendment rights, and the rise of KKK violence. They produced just an immense amount of testimony that is such a rich resource for historians today, really detailing acts of degradation and outright violence, often murder and rape, in response to Black Southerners, again, asserting their independence and transitioning to this life of freedom. And then the Department of Justice used that testimony and that evidence to launch a campaign against the KKK. They started in South Carolina. This was under the leadership of Amos Ackerman, who went down to the South, saw things on the ground for himself, and then convinced Grant in the fall of 1871 to declare, to suspend the writ of habeas corpus so that they could arrest Klan members and put them in jail and hold them over for trial. And he helped to really design how the Department of Justice was going to go after these guys, which was mostly on a charge of conspiracy. And I should say, I was writing these chapters as the January 6th insurrection was happening, and then the aftermath of that. And that was a very interesting moment. And we have seen in the year since how the Department of Justice is using kind of similar tactics as they did in 1871. And in fact, Merrick Garland has explicitly referred back to the 1871 KKK Act, which is what allowed Grant to suspend the writ, and basically makes the assertion that if a state is not protecting the civil rights of their citizens, then the federal government can step in and do so. And this to me was just such a profound moment. I think it was a high watermark for the federal government in protecting the rights of the nation's most vulnerable citizens. We would not see it again until the 1950s and 60s. And, this seemed kind of hand in hand also with the high watermark of saving Yellowstone for the benefit of the people, right? But that act had that darker history of native land dispossession and campaigns against Native people. And I think, we have a hard time now understanding that people could hold those two ideas in their heads at the same time and reconcile them. And because they were thinking Black freedom and Native suppression are part of a larger goal of American expansion, of American development, of this kind of land of free labor in America. And, now today, I think we think, well, wouldn't Native people and Black Southerners be aligned? Wouldn't we think of them together as marginalized peoples who have a similar relationship to the federal government? But in this period, they did not, because the Republican Party was so focused on, again, bringing both the West and the South kind of to heel and having this larger goal of a free labor future kind of across the nation. And they saw Black Southerners as part of that plan of moving forward, and they saw Native people as obstructing that plan.
Ackerman was a surprising person to be leading the charge on that, and you can say why, because his personal backstory is really fascinating. And in fact, your point about Merrick Garland, I screenshotted one of the paragraphs about Ackerman and his work and sent it to a friend who works at the Department of Justice as I was reading, and said, I'd like to learn more about this guy. Could you say more about whether you found interplay between the concerns that probably Southern Democrats had about the imposition of federal power in the South, and whether that affected their support during the discussions about the passage of the Yellowstone Act for that exercise of federal power there? I mean, you indicated that was a contested issue because it was a federal taking of sorts. But did their concerns to uphold white supremacy lead to them challenging conservation in a different part of the country?
Yeah, I think Democrats' major objection to the Yellowstone Act was the issue of federal power, and the kind of taking land out of development for white farmers and ranchers, anyone who was then going from the South to start a new life in the West. And so 70% of Democrats voted against the Yellowstone Act. The act was bipartisan, because then 30% did vote for it, and 89% of Republicans voted for it. But that means that 11% did not, right? And I couldn't quite tell. I have the roll call from the House, but not from the Senate, and it was really a kind of mix. There was no regional breakdown in the voting, and so it seemed like people were really coalescing around those two ideas. And most white Southerners were resisting federal power wherever it was, right? And they most certainly were resisting it in their own backyards as they were trying to reassert white supremacy after the Civil War, and undermine the civil rights of their neighboring Black Southerners. And they were also, though, I mean, all white Americans and also many Black Americans did not see that Native peoples had any rights that they were bound to respect, right? So the native land dispossession part was never really an objection. The only person who brought that up in the debate was actually a Republican from Nebraska named John Taft. And he just asked if Yellowstone was included in the Lakota lands as part of the treaty agreement at Fort Laramie in 1868. And Henry Dawes, who was a very powerful Republican in the House from Massachusetts, who would later author the Dawes Severalty Act, which took native lands out of native control and sold them to mostly white landowners, although also some Black landowners also. He just dismissed that concern out of hand and just said, it doesn't even matter, right? If it's part of Lakota treaty lands, we'll take them anyway. Because most of the treaties that had been negotiated with Indigenous peoples included sections that said if the government wants to take the lands for any purposes, usually for a railroad, they could do so. So he just dismissed that out of hand, and also made the argument that Native people couldn't live in Yellowstone any more than white people could. So, which is in fact not true. So, but that was actually an issue that united white Northerners and Southerners and Westerners, was a complete disregard for Indigenous land rights. So they would have supported any campaign that was overtly about that. But of course, the issue of federal power really complicated that.
When you tell the story of the politics of conservation, one of the things that stands out to me is that politicians like picture books. You spend a lot of time telling the story on the expedition, as well as in the kind of lobbying effort, focused on the ways that maps and then imagery was important to convincing people that this was a national treasure worth preserving, and obviously a much more complicated story than the pictures themselves told. But could you say a bit more about that? Because one of the things that strikes me, I was thinking today that I wonder if there's a lesson to learn. The IPCC has a lot of reports, have a lot of charts and graphs, but not as many pictures that tell a story that maybe words can't. And I wonder what you discovered about the photographs, the paintings, as well as the cartography.
Oh yeah, this is one of Hayden's great talents. Ferdinand Hayden, who was the leader of the survey, had been in the field as a geologist for 15 years before the Yellowstone expedition. He was a seasoned professional. He was leading his own surveys for several years before this. And I mean, I'm sure that, those of you out in the audience who work for the government or who have often applied for grants from government agencies will feel for Hayden, because what he was doing is that every year he had to lobby for money, and then he would go out in the field, do his work, and then he would come back, and he would have basically 3 months to write his reports and to distill all that information for the congressman, who he would submit the report, it would be published and then distributed. and then he would lobby for money again. So he had to prove every time, continually, that he was discovering interesting things. He had to prove that he was going to go to a new place and produce some really significant, important knowledge. And he knew that, congressmen would understand maybe some of the science, but definitely not all of the science. And so he very early on understood the power of visual images. He was delighted with the advent of photography, which really took off during the Civil War. He met William Henry Jackson in the late 1860s when they were both in Wyoming, and brought him onto his survey because he understood the power of photography, not only to show you kind of what was there, but also as proof that they had actually gone. Right? This is sort of evidence that he could compile and arrange into a story. He also knew that paintings, which, this is the era of the great landscape painters, of Frederick Edwin Church, of Albert Bierstadt, and then ultimately of Thomas Moran, who made his reputation painting the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which is a humongous 8 by 12 foot painting, which is now at the Department of the Interior, if you would like to go and see it. And so Hayden knew that those kinds of images were also important because they were in color. Right. And one of the most amazing things they already knew, kind of instantly upon entering Yellowstone, is the amazing colors of all of the geothermal features of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And so he knew that all of these images would be important. When he wrote his report for Congress, he included lots of sketches of specimens, but also, more than 20 illustrations and images, and also some color plates, which, he knew the significance that people would want to see what was actually there in color. He also put together, as he was lobbying for the Yellowstone Act, an exhibit in the rotunda. He got together some of his specimens, especially mineralogical specimens and some plants and fossils, and also a couple of photographs from William Henry Jackson and some of the watercolor sketches that Thomas Moran had made, and set them up in a little kind of mini exhibit in the rotunda as he was going and lobbying for the Yellowstone Act. And he, I think, benefited. The Senate debated the bill in January, but the House didn't debate it until the very end of February. And he was able to publish his report and a piece in Scribner's Monthly, which was lavishly illustrated, in the interim. And he made sure that he distributed copies of Scribner's and then also the reports immediately to congressmen so that they could see it and read it and be fully informed for their vote on the Yellowstone Act. So he was really forward thinking in this sense that he knew that people wanted to kind of consume nature in multiple ways, kind of by reading words, but also looking at images, and then also looking at objects. And he had a very close relationship with Spencer Baird, who was the assistant director of the Smithsonian and the director of expeditions there. And so he had an office in the Smithsonian. He was working with them, and a lot of the objects from the Yellowstone expedition went on display there as well. And so people could come and see them. They were open to the public.
You mentioned the piece he wrote in Scribner's, and I'm going to turn after this question to the audience. I can see that there's a couple questions. Feel free to put your question in the chat. How one of the things that struck me is that you tell the story several times of people that much of America was following along with this expedition, because the reports would come back, and it was an adventure story that was unfolding in real time. I wonder what you think as you think about today and the crowded kind of contest for people's attention. I mean, was this because America was bored, or is this actually, does this go back to what you were saying about people looking for meaning and national purpose after the Civil War? How much would the average person in Washington have known about this expedition? Or in New York or in any other major city? How much would they have known about this expedition?
I think, it's impossible to tell full on numbers, but one of the great advantages that we have today with digital collections is that this kind of thing is searchable. And so I used newspapers.com, which is a paid service, but a really excellent one. They have newspapers from all across the nation, beautifully digitally rendered and word searchable. And so I was able to search Hayden Expedition, Yellowstone kind of during this period, and found uh, reports on the expedition, reprinted excerpts from the Scribner's articles, all kinds of reporting on the Yellowstone Act itself in newspapers across the nation. And, newspapers were the primary way in which Americans kind of consumed their news and learned about things. And there were also reviews of Moran's painting. There were all kinds of little squibs kind of talking about Yellowstone and its importance. Sometimes they would show up in the same, with a column next to it that was about the KKK trials. Sometimes there would be a column next to it that was about Lakota action in their homeland and sort of attacks on surveyors or wagon trains. So people were consuming this news kind of all together. And so the newspapers were sort of the most democratic in the sense that they were the cheapest. But there were also these magazines coming to the fore, Harper's, which had been a kind of mainstay for a little while, these beautifully illustrated magazines. Scribner's Monthly was founded in 1870. So Scribner's published 4 pieces on Yellowstone in its first 2 years of publication, which is kind of amazing. There's a lot of attention to the expedition itself, and then also to Moran's painting, because Moran worked for Scribner's as an illustrator. And was very good friends with Richard Watson Gilder, who was one of the editors. So those magazines were for middle-class readers, and were really invested in giving those readers, travel narratives, exploration narratives, and also pieces that, again, would shore up this idea of America as exceptional, as quote unquote nature's nation, where we have these beautiful, amazing natural features that are unique in all the world. And they really prove that our country is unique and exceptional, and therefore worth kind of investing in. So I do think that the knowledge of this expedition and then the Yellowstone Act was widespread. And people did like to follow it. I mean, they liked reading about travel. This is also the great era of the travelogue and the Western adventure story. This is really when the West starts to emerge as a central site of American myth making about itself. And all of that is working together in this moment, I think, to support the whole idea of Yellowstone as a national park. And then also to support the idea that Yellowstone is, as Hayden called it, the heart of the continent. And he called it that because it contained the headwaters of several major rivers that then went and joined the Missouri, the Columbia, and the Colorado. But you can also think of it, and I think many Americans did think of it, and still do think of it, as an iconic landscape that you can only find in the United States.
I love that. I have a few more questions, but let me turn to one from the audience. Amid the climate crisis and mass extinction, the High Ambition Coalition has pledged to preserve 30% of Earth by 2030. What lessons do you think the Yellowstone story holds for preservation today? And understanding that you are a historian, which of the parts of that story do you think resonate most with the challenges around preservation today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a great question. And one of the major legacies of the passage of the Yellowstone Act is that it did preserve the Yellowstone Basin in 1872 quite early. And what happened in later years is that around it were preserved Shoshone National Forest, Custer-Gallatin National Forest, and then also Grand Teton National Park. So this whole area is now referred to as the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and it is one of the only largely intact temperate zone ecosystems in the world right now, which means that Hayden's kind of dream that Yellowstone would become a scientific laboratory has in fact come true. I was just a couple weeks ago at a biennial conference of scientists, and most of them are conservation scientists working on the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. All kinds of studies on plant life, on fish, on river otters. Those videos were amazing, by the way. And, grizzlies and the Wolf Project, all kinds of studies. And a group of scientists also came out last summer with a climate study that was based in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And so what Yellowstone is providing for us is a way to track change. And unfortunately, and I don't think this will be a surprise to you, Dan, or to anyone in the audience, but the signs are not good. Like, what we are learning through studying Yellowstone is that climate change is really having an effect that we are going to see in increasingly dramatic ways over the next kind of 10, 20, 30 years. And if we don't do anything about it, we are really going to see change. And the basic conclusions have been that what we're going to see is we're still going to have snow, but only at higher elevations, much higher, over 10,000 feet. So the precipitation between 10,000 and 5,000 is mostly going to be rain, which is not as effective for keeping water in the ground or in rivers. And so river flow is going to lessen. We're going to have more drought, more fires, more destruction of habitat for all the amazing animal life in Yellowstone. And that is going to continue even if we do make changes. But we need to make changes now, or it's really going to be catastrophic. And so Yellowstone teaches us that. It's really showing us what's happening in a place that has been, kind of regulated. It's not untouched. I mean, these areas are never untouched. They're always changing in response to human action and then also to natural change. But Yellowstone is providing a kind of base for us to learn about what we need to preserve going forward. And then it also, I think, shows us in the larger realm why preservation is important, because this is, we are able to do these studies. Scientists are able to do these studies now because Yellowstone was preserved in 1872.
One of the we've talked about two of the kind of main characters. The third is Cook, and in some sense, this was a preview of what ecotourism would be like, or something like that. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you think, what you took from his story in particular, because it's kind of a tragic story that has echoes with a lot of the intersections between development and capitalist enterprise and preservation today.
Yeah. I never thought that I would become so interested in the life of an investment banker, but I did become interested.
He was an interesting investment banker because of his role in the Civil War.
Yeah, and he made a major mistake. So we can definitely learn. We can learn from him. Cook grew up in Ohio. He was one of these people who showed a great talent for math and business really young. So he left school at 14. He became a clerk in a bank. And he made his fortune in his own investment company during the Civil War by selling U.S. war bonds. So he, made a nifty profit, made millions of dollars while also supporting the U.S. war effort. Selling these bonds to the American people. They would buy it for $50, make an investment in the country and in the war effort, and then they could, cash that in later for their $50 plus 7% in gold. And it was a really, really good investment. And he was really good. He, like Hayden, knew the power of advertising. He knew the power of images. And in the years after the war, he was really searching for a new project that was going to give him that kind of same sense of satisfaction, that same sense of patriotism. And he hit upon the Northern Pacific Railroad, which had been chartered in 1864. It was supposed to be the Centennial Line. It was supposed to be finished by 1876 to celebrate the nation's centennial. And that was Jay Cook's goal. And he really felt like if he was able to push this railroad through, that it would be, as his brother Henry called it, the grandest achievement of our lives, right? Like this was going to be another way that he would make his mark. Unfortunately, and what's interesting about this moment is that Jay Cook was really, really smart and he knew business really, really well. And none of his colleagues could figure out why he did this. They were like, this is railroads are terrible investments. They are very hard to finance because mostly they are relying on kind of government land grants in order to build track. So in order to build track, you have to have money to do that. But in order to have money to do that, you have to sell the land that is along the track to investors. But in order to get that land, you have to build the track. So it's kind of it's a problem. And so you're always kind of operating with very little cash and trying to get it from investors. And he was just having a terrible time selling railroad bonds. He was not able to sell them to Americans. He was not able to sell them to Europeans. But he became a little obsessed with this project, and he made a huge mistake, which no investment banker should ever make, which is that he began to loan the Northern Pacific money from his own investment bank. So the money that other people had invested with him to invest in projects, he was giving directly to the Northern Pacific, and it was just disappearing. And so he was really intent on building this line, on getting it done. He wanted to build it right through the center of Lakota territory. He wanted to build a station right north in what is now the town of Livingston, Montana, and then build a spur line down to the northern entrance of what would become Yellowstone National Park. So he was very interested in Hayden's expedition. He supported it. He actually sent Thomas Moran to join the expedition. He knew of him from Philadelphia. They were both based there. And he really did see tourism as a major driver of railroad traffic and transportation. And those two things go hand in hand, kind of tourism and transportation. Like every time you see kind of leap forward in transportation, you see a shift in tourism, usually a huge increase. And the way that people kind of travel to other places and think of them as destinations and think of the journey there as part of the trip. So he was really invested in that, and he thought this was a way he was going to recoup all of his money. But he ended up loaning the Northern Pacific $2 million. And by September of 1873, when his investors came calling, he didn't have any money to give them. And when Jay Cooke and Company closed, that is what sparked the Panic and Depression of 1873. So that was also another surprise as I was researching to kind of have this connection too. There are a lot of interesting connections to events that you don't really usually associate with Yellowstone, like the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Also, the Panic and Depression of 73 is directly related to Yellowstone, to this Northern Pacific project, and then also to Lakota resistance. Pretty directly related to Sitting Bull's efforts in that region to stop Cook from building that road.
Yes, most of us didn't know that Old Lady Larry's cow also destroyed a bunch of specimens that were collected on the Hayden expedition. One of the things, but I mean, of necessity, given the time, the book mostly tells the story of men, and sadly, kind of the most sympathetic female characters mostly die in childbirth, or for other health related reasons. I wondered if in the course of your research you uncovered anything about what if anything the nascent women's movement had to do with a movement around preservation, or their interaction with kind of the exploration for exploitation of the West, and whether there was anything, whether there were any female characters that you came across during the course of your research that might have sparked an interest in digging deeper.
Yeah, I was looking throughout this project and just like, come on, I was really hoping actually that there would be a woman who was working at the Smithsonian. I thought that was the most likely sort of place. The reality of this period is that, exploration was a world of men. Congress was the world of men. Banking was the world of men. There were women everywhere. And that's why I tried to, every time a woman entered the story, I named her. I talked about her a little bit. Women not only were kind of fully engaged with their husbands in this moment. The wives of the surveyors. Then also Hayden got married in November of 1871 after coming home from Yellowstone. And yes, Jay Cook's, spoiler alert, but Jay Cook's wife unfortunately dies in the summer of 1871, which, I mean, I think actually maybe causes a little bit of his sort of complete Ahab-like monomania about the Northern Pacific, because he was in mourning and he needed something to focus on. But there are women everywhere. I mean, there are women in Salt Lake who are helping to provision the expedition. There are women living on farms along the route who are trading with the expedition members. There are laundresses at the forts who are helping them. I mean, there are women everywhere in this story, but there was not, unfortunately, I kept looking. There was not a single woman whose narrative I could kind of fully integrate into this story in a way that would be satisfying to the reader, where you would know enough about her, where she played a strong enough role that she could have a kind of starring role. So that was a great frustration to me writing this book, is that I didn't get to write about more women. But the next book, I do. Half of the protagonists are women in the next book, so I'm super excited about that, including the first two that readers will meet and encounter. So that's been really enjoyable to read those histories and start to really dig into them. But yeah, women started to kind of take on stronger roles in conservation and preservation a little bit later in the 19th century, kind of in the 1880s, started to get involved with organizations like Mass Audubon. But men still dominated the kind of popular discussion of preservation. So if you think of people like John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, these are the people who are dominating the kind of national discourse and also the policy discourse on conservation and preservation. But of course, as often happens, especially during this period, women are doing a lot of the work and often working behind the scenes to make these things happen.
Great. I mean, one of the things that I guess, while still imbalanced, one of the things that's different today is that there is a more inclusive public debate in terms of voices about preservation issues and conservation issues, and it will be interesting to see what kind of comparisons might be drawn, given that how that enriches or makes more complicated or more productive in the long run. One of the things that struck me about the political timeline that you told is that the expedition happens in the summer of 1871, and by March of 1872, the legislation is signed by the president to preserve. I mean, would that we lived in an era where you could do some research and then 9 months later the president is signing something that is based upon that research and protecting over 1 million acres somewhere. I don't think we're going to see change that quick anytime soon. But I think the book is replete with lessons for how we can recognize the complexity of the interactions between preservation and race and economic justice and politics that relate to issues, finance. All of the different threads that you pull together into this narrative. I want to give you a chance to offer any closing comments and ask a fun one to conclude, which is, have you watched the series Yellowstone, or have you reached out to the producers and offered to do a consulting credit? And anything else you want to finish up with?
Oh, have I watched that show? Yes, I have. Yes, Yellowstone. I actually binge watched it after I finished the book, because I was like, I know I'm going to get questions about this. I just know it. And see, you have proven me right.
I'm obliging.
Yes. That show is very uneven, I will say, but it also has some of the most interesting kind of thematic strains in it of any Western I have ever seen, really. And certainly a Western in modern memory. It also has the most complicated and layered indigenous characters of any Western that I have seen recently. 1883 is another story. We can get to that later. But yes, I have been trying. I've been like, I need to talk to Taylor Sheridan. I just need to sit down. Just give me 5 minutes. I just need to talk to him. Because it is uneven. I mean, there's such great promise in it. But then sometimes it'll just then go by the wayside, and it can be frustrating. But one thing that I would like readers to take away from the book is a kind of greater understanding of the fullness of Yellowstone's history, and to know that, we can go to Yellowstone and still enjoy all of its natural wonders while knowing about all of this very complicated history. And, during this 150th year, Yellowstone National Park is doing several things to bring in Indigenous voices into the tourist experience of the park. They've set up a Native center at Old Faithful. There's going to be an all nations teepee village at Gardner at the northern entrance in August. And the park and the superintendent, Cam Shawley, are in constant communication with the 27 tribal nations that have official relationships with Yellowstone National Park, and talking about the way forward. And I think this is also, it's important to know about the Indigenous history of this area so that we can inform these discussions, because this is something very present with us today, right? Like how do we acknowledge Indigenous presence and history and land stewardship in the stories that we tell about national parks when we are in them? And that's a conversation that we need to keep having on the policy level, and then also on the kind of cultural level and the personal level also.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us. Everybody go out and get Megan's book. You can get it at any independent bookstore or other places online if you wish. And thanks again, Megan, for being with us today. And for those of you who enjoyed this talk, come back next week. We'll have a conversation, a totally different kind of conversation with a political philosopher who's made the moral case for why this generation is the pivotal generation for tackling climate change. So we'll see you next week to talk with Henry Shue. Thanks again, Megan. Really appreciate your spending the time with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.